Welcome to Straight Talk About Carbon, a content partnership with Agoro Carbon Alliance on Brownfield. I'm your host for today's program, Meghan Grebner. With me is Caleb Smith, who is a conservation agronomist with Agoro. Hello.
Hello. It's good to be here.
I thank you for joining us. It's really been a fascinating conversation as we've gotten a little deeper each week talking about carbon in Agoro Carbon Alliance as well. So I'm interested to see where our conversation takes us today. But before we get started, Caleb, why don't you talk a little bit about your background and how you came to Agoro?
Yeah, sure. So I'm a conservation agronomist from Agoro. I'm located in East Central Indiana. I did my bachelor's degree in biology at Indiana University, my master's at Purdue in agronomy, where I studied cover crops and how they affect soil physical properties as well as soil carbon. In the past, I was an agronomist for both Indigo Ag as well as Beck's hybrids and their seed corn production. I've always been really drawn towards the path of sustainability. That's really what got me into agriculture. So this was a perfect fit for me. And as a conservation agronomist at Agoro, my primary job is to help farmers understand how exactly to monetize sustainability on their operation with carbon credits, and really to help them understand how this whole process works. So hopefully today I can continue to do that and with some more education.
You are literally a house divided in one house with a bachelor's or your undergrad at IU and your master's work at Purdue.
Yeah, it's a tricky situation for sure. I get both sides just don't like me, so it's a lose-lose.
Well, in this house, you're always welcome.
That's good. At least I'm welcome.
Today, we're going to talk and we're going to dig into understanding really the science of soil carbon sequestration. So from an environmental standpoint, why is carbon sequestration vital for our planet moving forward?
Yeah, so I think most people understand how we got in this situation, right? In the early 18th century, the Industrial Revolution really resulted in a mass population growth and a lot of growth in industrialization. And that trend has continued up to today. And as a result of that, we have amassed a lot of CO2 in our atmosphere. And we're continuing to amass CO2 in our atmosphere. And this has really resulted in more variable weather patterns. So it's becoming harder to predict what's going to happen with the weather. And this, of course, will make farming very challenging in the future. So essentially, in order to fight climate change, in order to reduce climate change, to lessen the effects in the future, we really have to do two things. We have to reduce our emissions, and we as a society can collectively do this by changing our behavior, changing the way as companies we make products, but we also have to increase the amount of carbon being sequestered. So on their own, these two things will not work independently to fix the problem. We have to do these things together, right? So, that's to me why it's so vital to fight this climate change issue.
When we talk about sequestration in general, or talking about sequestering carbon in the soil versus other methods like air capture, what are some of those advantages?
Yeah, so there are multiple ways to remove carbon from the atmosphere. One of those ways is called direct air capture. And this essentially involves almost like a factory where they suck the carbon out of the atmosphere, for a lack of better words. They send it through a filter with a sorbent in it that will essentially draw the CO2 out, and they can send that through a pipeline into Earth's crust. Okay, so that way is fine. But the other way that is much more practical is actually by using managed land throughout the world, such as farmland and forest land, to alter our management practices and do things that result in carbon sequestration. So all these things that involve land management utilize the process of photosynthesis, which converts gaseous CO2 into physical plant biomass, where it can physically or hopefully be stored in the soil long term. With this form of land or terrestrial carbon sequestration, we have all these other ancillary benefits. When we increase the carbon in our soil, we increase the fertility of those soils. We increase the ability of them to produce crops without as much external inputs. So there are all these downstream effects of terrestrial carbon sequestration, sequestering carbon in the soil of our farms that benefit society as a whole. And it's not to say that direct air capture isn't necessary, right? This is an all hands on deck situation to fight climate change. But to us, the terrestrial climate change or terrestrial carbon sequestration is the most practical way of doing it because it's ready-made. We have billions of acres farmed by millions of farmers and land managers that can do this right now.
Carbon credit is 1 metric ton. So how are those quantified when we're talking about soil and measured in soil?
Yeah, so a big part of this is the monitoring, reporting, and verifying changes in soil carbon. It's very important that the changes that we are tracking are actually valid changes so they can have a real impact on reducing our greenhouse gases. So the first step is we have to establish a baseline. So we have a 10-year contract. At year 0, prior to farmers starting these new practices, we will come in and we will measure the carbon stock of that soil down to about 2 feet or 60 centimeters. This essentially involves sampling at a specific location, measuring total organic carbon as well as bulk density, and this will give us a value of tons of soil carbon per acre. We'll come back to those same spots at year 5 and at year 10 after the practices have been implemented, and we will measure those same things again. So by doing that, we can actually track changes in soil carbon stock as these practices go on. This sampling is actually audited, you could say, or verified by the registry. The registries are the ones that issue the credit. So once that registry verifies that the carbon has actually been sequestered, they verify our sampling protocol, they will actually issue credits at year 5 and year 10 after that sampling. So this is basically a way that we can make sure what we're doing is actually making a real difference.
So it's basically your proof in principle, right? Like you're
Exactly.
proving that farmers are actually sequestering carbon.
Yeah, and one thing that we do that's sort of maybe not unique, but it's definitely important is we measure at different depths. Okay, so this allows us to stratify the depths and figure out what the carbon dynamics of the whole soil profile. And this really allows us to get a better idea of what's working in terms of practice changes and their ability to move the needle on soil carbon. So by measuring those different depths, we can learn a lot more.
Most farmers understand soil organic matter because it's routinely measured with basic fertility sampling. So how is soil organic matter related to organic carbon?
Yeah, so most of us are familiar with soil organic matter, right? It just refers to the fraction of the soil that consists of plant, animal, microbial tissues that are in various stages of decomposition. From an elemental standpoint, soil organic matter is about 58% soil organic carbon. So if a farmer knows what his soil organic matter levels are, most are 1 to 6%, and you make basic assumptions about the weight of an acre furrow slice, you can actually figure out what your carbon stock is down to that 6 inches. So some farmers, it helps to know because soil organic matter is familiar. Soil organic carbon is somewhat foreign. Oftentimes the results are arbitrary to them if they have no reference point. So by understanding the relationship between soil organic matter and soil organic carbon, it makes it a little bit easier to understand what we're trying to do.
What soil properties influence carbon storage?
Yeah, so when we're thinking about carbon sequestration, there's 2 parts to the carbon sequestration equation. The first step is we have to have an increase in net primary productivity. So this means we have to increase the amount of biomass that we have in a given field area. So cover crops are typically a very good way to do this, okay? So once we have that carbon that's brought into the system, the second thing that has to happen is it has to be stabilized in the soil. If it's not stabilized, it'll be mineralized back into the atmosphere, and then we won't have a net gain in carbon. So there's really a trade-off, right? Some soils are really good at storing carbon. Some soils are very good at growing carbon. Typically, soils with a very high clay content, for example, are very good at storing carbon, right? Because clay content has a lot of reactive surface area. That reactive surface area can bond organic carbon in the soil through a variety of chemical bonds, and it's a way of stabilizing the carbon long term. Climate has a lot to do with it. Typically, carbon storage is favored in cool, humid climates. If we think about the Alaska permafrost, where a lot of our carbon is stored, that's essentially because the plants there are really well adept at growing in these cold climates, and the microbes that are responsible for all the transformations of carbon in the soil can't keep up with the amount of biomass grown into the system. So, areas with high rainfall and low temperatures often favor carbon accumulation. On the opposite end of the spectrum, we can think about, areas that are very dry and very warm, places like desert climates. These systems are obviously not good at making carbon, and they're not good at storing it. So there's always a trade-off, right? If we have too high of clay, we won't be able to produce the carbon, but if we have too low clay and a sandy soil, we might not be able to store it. So like most things in nature, carbon storage is dictated by a lot of different things at a lot of different scales. If we think about the difference between two fields across the street from each other in the same county, what drives carbon storage in those two fields is going to be much different from what drives it between a field in Africa versus maybe Indiana. So it's very scale dependent.
Caleb Smith's a conservation agronomist with Agoro Carbon Alliance. Caleb, as we wrap up another fascinating conversation this week, I want to talk a little bit about reduced tillage and cover crops. So as we look at those, how do they help increase the soil's ability to store and capture carbon?
Yeah, so all these practices are all basically functioning to make an environment in the soil ecosystem that's very conducive to carbon storage. So let's first think about reducing tillage. Why is that important? Well, essentially, when we're tilling our soils, we are making an environment that is more conducive to planting, right? We are getting warmer quicker and it's drying out quicker. The issue is that often results in the destruction of aggregates. And these aggregates are very important because one of the most important mechanisms of carbon storage is physical isolation within the pore space of aggregates, all right? So some carbon is stabilized through chemical bonding. Some carbon is stabilized in this way of physical isolation. Essentially what happens is this organic carbon in the soil becomes trapped within microaggregates. So aggregates less than 50 nanometers in size. And they're basically isolated from the microbes that want to degrade them, right? So this is a very important mechanism because it can store carbon in various sources. So it can store labile carbon, intermediate carbon, maybe more stable carbon that we think of. When we're tilling, we're destroying these aggregates and we're causing over mineralization. And this obviously makes it very difficult for the soil to store the carbon long term. It also has a very deleterious effect on the soil microbes that are responsible for all these transformations. It also, a big mechanism of carbon loss that people don't think of is actually erosion. When we're losing that soil, we're also losing the carbon in that soil. So tillage is obviously very good at reducing erosion. All right, when we're thinking about cover crops, we're thinking about the first part of that sequestration equation, increase in net primary productivity. Cover crops allow us to capture sunlight and harvest sunlight and take advantage of photosynthesis year round. And what it's really good at doing is getting roots in the ground in times when there normally wouldn't be. And those roots are really important, right? Because most of the carbon that's stabilized in the soil comes from root litter. Root litter decomposition is around 30% slower than that of leaf litter. Only about 1% of above ground biomass actually becomes stable carbon. So, cover crops are essentially just a way for us to extend that sunlight harvesting period for us to get more carbon into the system. And if we're thinking about how different species of cover crops affect carbon storage, well, our legume cover crops are going to be really superior at storing carbon because the chemistry of legume cover crops, the leaf chemistry, really favors microbial breakdown pathways that favor carbon stored in a more stable form. So essentially with legume cover crops, you have more carbon being stored as mineral associated organic matter, which is very stable. It's much more stable than particulate organic matter. So once again, when we're talking about cover crops, there's all these different influences, but generally speaking, cover crops and reducing your tillage are a great place to start when you're thinking about increasing soil carbon.
Caleb, thank you so much for your time today and your insight. If folks want to find out more information about the science of soil carbon sequestration, the possibilities of carbon capture and a carbon market for their operations, what's the best way for them to do so?
Yeah, so our website, agorocarbonalliance.com, it has a ton of great information. We also have what's called the Knowledge Hub, which has articles from myself and other conservation agronomists around all these topics, around the topic of the science of soil carbon sequestration, amongst other things, maybe information about the carbon market. Anything you want to find related to the carbon markets, you can find at the Knowledge Hub at agorocarbon.com.
Caleb, it's great chatting with you today. Have a great week.
Yeah, Meghan, great chatting with you as well. I enjoyed it, and have a great weekend yourself.
Again, to learn more, go to agorocarbonalliance.com. I'm Meghan Grebner with Straight Talk About Carbon, a content partnership with Agoro Carbon Alliance on Brownfield.